What's up, everybody? Today I am here to do my June reading wrap up. I read a total of 11 books this month, plus one that I DNF'd, which I will be talking about first. And this might surprise some people. The book that I DNF'd in particular, as you guys know, I don't do that very often. When I start a book, I intend to finish it, even if I'm not enjoying it that much. However, sometimes I'm just not feeling it at all, and I just don't want to force myself to keep reading. I feel like doing that will put me into another reading slump potentially. If it's a book that I just am not getting anything out of, or I'm bored by, or whatever the case may be, I do occasionally put books down. Not very often. I think I've only DNF'd, a couple times this year. This is probably my second or third book I've DNF'd, or maybe. But yeah, the very first book that I started to read this month and that I put down. Are you guys ready for this? There's going to be some fans out there that are going to be pissed for this book that I'm about to show you. But that is You Like It Darker by Stephen King. Yes, I pre-ordered this book and was excited to get it. And I'm not even the biggest Stephen King fan in the world. There's still a lot of his books I haven't even read yet. But I thought it would be fun to just pick up one of his new releases. I've never actually bought one of his books or pre-ordered it brand new before. And I absolutely love the cover art to this one with this giant crocodile here on the cover, and it kind of wraps around. And the crocodile is also kind of embossed on the cover. So you're supposed to be able to feel the scales, I guess. I don't know. But yeah, I just thought, what the heck? I'll try out his new book, give it a shot. This is a short story collection. I love Stephen King short story collections for the most part. However, I think I made it 4 stories into this book, and I had to put it down. This book is so mind-numbingly boring. It's not even horror. And it's called You Like It Darker, and there's even... I think there was an introduction in this book, or maybe I'm thinking of the afterword. I can't remember. Yeah, I guess there wasn't an introduction, but there's an afterword in here. I think Stephen King talking about writing darker stories, darker fiction. This is not dark at all. Literally, the first story in this book is about 2 old guys who go on a hunting trip. They have this alien encounter with these, alien cosmic beings. And these alien creatures grant them these special skills, these superpowers to make them very good at what they do in life. One of them, I think, is a writer. And then the other one, I believe, is an artist, I want to say. And then together, they go on to become famous and sell millions of books and rich and very successful in life because of these special powers that were granted to them by these aliens. And this novella, this is not a short story, by the way. This is like a 60 or 70 page novella in this book. Yeah. That was just the first story. I proceeded to read the next few. And yeah, I cannot get into this at all. I think Stephen King is losing his touch. I think he probably needs to retire pretty soon. I really love Night Shift. That's my all-time favorite Stephen King book. I love his older short stories that are actually horror and that are actually short stories. Most of the stories in here are 50, 60, 70 pages long. There were a few shorter ones that were, appropriate length for a short story, 10 pages or so. But if I want to read a novella, I'll read a novella. When I'm going to a short story collection, I don't want multiple 75-page stories in here where they don't need to be. And they're just mindless, endless detail. They don't need to be that long. And yeah. And then, of course, too, just the subject matter, the content, story about 2 guys meeting some aliens. That's not for me at all. Not my cup of tea. Not up my alley, however you want to phrase that. And yeah, I DNF'd this book. I'm sorry to all the Stephen King fans out there. I will say I did skip ahead and read one of the stories towards the back of this book. It's called Laura, I think, or Lori. And the reason I read that one is because I heard that it featured the crocodile or alligator that you see on the front of the cover here. So I wanted to read that story and at least read about this guy. And that story I enjoyed a little bit more than the first few in here. I thought it was decent. It was fine. Better than the first few stories, but it still wasn't anything that great or that special. So yeah. You Like It Darker by Stephen King. This was the first book I tried reading this month, and I had to just put it down. And I don't even know if I'm going to keep this book in my collection or get rid of it. I'm not even sure, to be honest. So yeah, it has a really cool cover. If that's worth anything. Okay. The second book that I read this month is The Count of Monte Cristo by Alexander Dumas. This absolute behemoth of a book. I did an individual video and review for this one, so I won't go into too much detail about it here, but I really enjoyed this book. This was pretty good. A little bit longer than it needed to be at 1,200 pages, but this was quite the experience. This was a reading experience quite unlike anything I've ever had. It was a very interesting book. There's a lot of themes in here. Very, very intricate, kind of complex plot. A lot of characters. There's a lot going on in this story. I don't think it'll be for everybody. There were a few times, too, where I was getting even a little bit confused and a little bit tired and frustrated with how drawn out the story is. But it was still very, very good. I really enjoyed all of the themes in the story. The main character, the Count of Monte Cristo himself, is one of the coolest fictional characters I've ever read about. This guy is such a badass. He is wrongly imprisoned for like 15 years. And he comes up with just the coolest and most elaborate revenge plot ever. It's not him just going out to, like, you know, kill the guys that wrongly imprisoned him. You know, he has like all of these enemies that were part of this plan to send him to prison. And it's not like him just going out to like kill these guys or anything like that. He comes up with these really clever ways to get revenge on them that doesn't involve their death necessarily. Not all of these characters do survive, but it's not necessarily the Count's fault. You know, he doesn't believe in like killing people, kind of. He's sort of like this righteous guy, and he like has like a new perspective on life after being in prison for so long. And yeah, it's just, there's a lot of interesting stuff in here. This is one that, if you can handle a longer story and you're into classics, I would recommend checking this out. But yeah, I gave The Count of Monte Cristo a 3.75 out of 5. I wanted to give it higher, but again, it was just a bit too long and confusing at times. And far from perfect, but this was a very good book. So yeah, The Count of Monte Cristo is technically the first book that I read all the way through this month, but yeah, there's that one. Okay, the third book I read this month is Henry and Ribsy by Beverly Cleary. I'm continuing my read-through of the Henry Huggins / Ramona series by Beverly Cleary. I read a lot of these books when I was a kid, and I've been greatly enjoying rereading through these. I have a lot of nostalgia for these. I absolutely love these books. And this one is pretty good. There's a chapter, I think it's the last chapter of this book. Again, for those of you who don't know, these books are basically short story collections. Each chapter is where Henry Huggins just goes on like a different adventure or gets into mischief with his dog or his friends. Just different things happen. I like that. And the very last chapter in this book is where him and Ribsy go on a fishing trip. They go salmon fishing, and that like last chapter is hilarious. It is just so much fun, and it is one of my favorite short stories, I guess you could say, of all of the Henry Huggins series that I've read so far. I really enjoyed that one. Overall, this was a pretty good book, about in line with the other ones I've read in terms of quality. Beverly Cleary is a pretty consistent author. There's not a lot of low points in these books, like at all. They're pretty consistently enjoyable, I would say. And I gave this one a 3.5 out of 5 stars. So yeah, that's Henry and Ribsy, third book I read. Okay, the fourth book I read this month is another classic. I have quite a few classics in here. I didn't really plan on reading a lot of classics. I just was in the mood for that kind of thing. So yeah, the fourth book that I read this month is The Adventures of Pinocchio by Carlo Collodi. I believe is how you pronounce his name. This is the original Pinocchio book written in, let me check because I'm going to get the date wrong. I'm not seeing the date for some reason on the copyright page. Oh, right, here we go. Originally published in Italian in 1883. So yes, this is a very old book. And this is unlike anything that Disney or any of the other various renditions and adaptations throughout the years would have you believe about this story. Those are all very different from this. And what led me to want to read the original Pinocchio story? was R.L. Stine, my idol, said somewhere in an interview or an article that I read, I can't remember exactly. I've seen a lot of interviews with R.L. Stine and read a lot of articles about him. But he said somewhere that he really loved the original Pinocchio story. He said I believe his mother used to read this to him when he was a child, and it actually scared him. And this was like part of what influenced him and his love for horror. And I remember there was one scene in particular, R.L. Stine said that scared him, where Pinocchio falls asleep by a fire and burns his legs off, and he wakes up and his legs are just gone. And yes, that does happen in this book, and it is quite graphic, even though he is just a wooden puppet. You know, there's no blood or anything like that. Obviously, he's just a puppet, but still, this book is pretty violent at times, even though it's a children's story. There are evil characters trying to con Pinocchio, people trying to kill him. There are these characters. There's like this talking fox and some other talking animal, and they're trying to like con Pinocchio out of money, following him like throughout the story, and just trying to do bad things to him. And at one point, they try to kill him. They like wrap a rope around his neck and haul him up in a tree and like try to hang him to death. And Pinocchio is like choking and about to like die. And then I think right before he does, I believe this bird comes in and like saves the day and like cuts the rope. I think it was a bird. Details are a little bit fuzzy in memory, but yeah, there's some pretty violent things that happen in this Pinocchio book. It's a very action-packed story, and it's also just very bizarre too. It reminds me a little bit of like an Alice's Adventures in Wonderland or Wizard of Oz type of book, where there's just a lot of crazy stuff happening. There's a lot of humor in here. It's just a very bizarre, but I was vibing with it. I liked it for how weird it was. I think it got me to laugh a couple of times, and I remember just being kind of surprised at some of the things that happen in here, honestly. I really enjoyed Pinocchio. This was a good book. I never thought I would be saying I liked anything to do with Pinocchio. I was never a fan of like the Pinocchio movie when I was a kid. It's something that never really appealed to me, but after reading this, I can say I'm a fan now of this original novel at the very least. And it's pretty short too. It's only like 150 pages about, I think. Yeah, about 150 pages. So yeah, if you've never read the original Pinocchio story, I would recommend giving this a shot. This was a pretty good book. I gave it a solid 3.5 out of 5 stars. So yeah, this was a pretty good book. And even though it is kind of a children's story, I think adults will get a lot of enjoyment out of this as well. So yeah. Okay. The next book that I read this month is another classic, and kind of a children's classic, I guess you could say. And that is The Complete Fairy Tales of Charles Perrault. I hope I'm pronouncing his name correctly. Probably not. But yes, this is part of the Oxford World Classic series. And as the title implies, this is The Complete Fairy Tales of Charles Perrault. He is the guy that brought us Cinderella, Sleeping Beauty, Little Red Riding Hood, what else? Bluebeard, Puss in Boots, and that's most of them actually. He did not write a ton. This is a pretty thin book, about 150 pages as well in length. And some of these fairy tales, there's like a long introduction at the beginning of this book. Some of these short fairy tales that he wrote, not all of them were ones he came up with. I think some of them have been around for a really long time. Little Red Riding Hood specifically is one of them, where it's just been passed down throughout the years. The origins of that story are kind of unknown, but he was the first one to kind of write the story and make it more mainstream and accessible to the public, which is why he's kind of credited as like the story's main author, I guess, or original author. And there are also a few poems at the beginning of this book, like prose poems, or tales in verse, if you want to call them that. I believe there's 3 of them. And I will just say that even though this is kind of like a children's collection of stories, again, the first 3 like prose poems in this book are more for an adult audience. They deal with kind of adult subject matter and involve some things that young children should probably not be hearing. But I enjoyed all of them immensely. I was pretty surprised at how much I enjoyed just those poems, let alone the rest of this book, the rest of these fairy tales. I love classic fairy tales. I love the Brothers Grimm. All of those old fairy tales. I've always had an affinity for that sort of thing. And this book did not disappoint at all. I absolutely love this book. I gave it a solid 4 out of 5 stars. Spoiler alert, this is probably my favorite book that I read this month, in close contention with a couple of others, Count of Monte Cristo being one of them. But yeah, this book was awesome. There were only a couple of stories in here I didn't care for as much. I guess I'll run through the contents real quick so you guys can know what they are. So the prose poems or tales in verse were The History of Griselda. Loved it. 3 Silly Wishes was very short. That was a very short, like 3-page poem. But it was really funny. I enjoyed that one as well. Donkey Skin, absolutely amazing. I love that poem. And then the short stories are Sleeping Beauty, Little Red Riding Hood, Bluebeard. Bluebeard, let me pause on that one. If any of you have ever heard or read the original Bluebeard poem, oh my god, is it dark and disturbing and probably should not be read to children. But I loved it. It was very great. Extremely violent, and there is a very gory, disturbing scene in that story. And yeah, it was awesome. I love how brutal these old school fairy tales are. I don't think fairy tales like this, they write them like this for kids today. Disney have like butchered all of these fairy tales by making them into poor animated movies, in my opinion. But yeah, anyway, Puss in Boots, The Fairies, Cinderella, Ricky the Tuft, and Hop of My Thumb. So yeah, those are all the stories. There's not really a lot of them, but I really enjoyed this book overall. This was an awesome book. 4 out of 5 stars for The Complete Fairy Tales of Charles Perrault. Okay, the next book I read this month is the next book in the Henry Huggins and Ramona series. This one is Beezus and Ramona. And I also gave this one a 3.5 out of 5 stars. Not really a lot to say about these. It's just these characters getting into more shenanigans, and Ramona in particular just being a brat. She is such a bratty character, and it's kind of her older sister Beezus learning how to deal with that and learning how to deal with her younger sister, basically, who's just a total brat. If you've read these books, you know what I'm talking about. Ramona is horrible. She's like, I can't remember how old she is in these books. I want to say she's like 4 years old. And she's like Angelica from the Rugrats. She's just a little demon. But yeah, these books, they're just super nostalgic for me. I love Beverly Cleary's writing. She's just one of the best children's authors of all time, in my opinion. And I plan on continuing to read through this entire series. So yeah, Beezus and Ramona, 3.5 out of 5 stars for that one. Okay, the next book I read this month. This is actually a reread. I've read this one a few times now. I think this is my 3rd time reading it. And it is The Jungle Books by Rudyard Kipling. And this is the other one that's kind of in close contention for my favorite book that I've read this month. This actually might be my favorite one, to be honest. So previously, I think the last time I read this book, I gave it like a perfect 5 out of 5 stars, which, as you guys know, that's very rare for me. I don't hand out 5 stars very often. I think after rereading this again, I'm going to lower it down to 4 stars. For those of you who maybe haven't read the Jungle Books yet, this is essentially a collection of short stories. It's split up into 2 books. They were originally published separately. It was originally published as just the Jungle Book, and then a second one was released later on. And this one contains both books, and it's very slim. Both books are very short. They're like 150 pages each, for a total of this book being about 300 pages long. And it's a short story collection about animals, basically, talking animals. And the first Jungle Book, the first half of the Jungle Book, I'd say like the first few short stories, like the first 75 pages of the book, roughly, are stories actually about Mowgli and him being raised by the wolves and living in the jungle with Baloo, the bear, and all of the other infamous Jungle Book characters that you probably know about. And then the second half of the first Jungle Book, the last, 50 or 70 pages or whatever it is, are short stories that are completely unrelated to Mowgli and his adventures and him growing up in the jungle. And the reason I decided to lower my star rating for this book by 1 is because not all of the short stories are that great. There were a few short stories in here, mostly just the unrelated ones. I loved reading about Mowgli. Those were all amazing. Pretty much near perfect in my opinion. But some of the unrelated short stories in here were just kind of boring, to be honest. There were a couple of them that I even skimmed through a little bit. And yeah, not all of them were that great, so I decided to lower my rating for this book a little bit. And then in the second Jungle Book, every other short story is about Mowgli and his life in the jungle, and then the stories in between are again unrelated short stories following other random animals in different parts of the world. And yeah, again, some of those unrelated stories weren't the best. Some of them were. There's one that I think is probably one of the most popular and well-known ones, and definitely one of the best, and that story is Rikki Tikki Tavi. It's about this meerkat who is protecting this family from these killer cobras, I'm pretty sure they are. These cobras are like trying to kill this family living in this whatever part of the world they're in. And this meerkat is basically protecting them and killing these cobras and defending this family. It's a super awesome story. Very entertaining. I love that one. And there were some other pretty good stories that were unrelated to Mowgli, but yeah, overall, 4 out of 5 stars. I absolutely love the Jungle Books. This is a classic, one of my favorite books. It's just a shame that not all the short stories in here were that great. Some of them just felt like filler content, honestly. I wanted to read more about Mowgli and less about some other random characters that, yeah, have nothing to do with him. So yeah, 4 out of 5 stars for the Jungle Books. Okay. The next book that I read is The Bad Beginning by Lemony Snicket. This is the very first book in a series of unfortunate events. And I read through this series when I was a kid. So it's been a very, very long time since I've read these. And I actually just recently went on eBay and bought like the complete set of these because I decided that I wanted to read through this series again. And yeah, I enjoyed this first book. It wasn't great. I gave it like a flat 3 out of 5 stars. I think this is a pretty good, pretty decent start to the series. It's not amazing. I believe there are some better books later on in the series. But it's simply good. I enjoyed it. So yeah, that's The Bad Beginning by Lemony Snicket, the very first one. The next book that I read this month is another classic, The Hound of the Baskervilles by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. And this is a Sherlock Holmes mystery. I had never read any Sherlock Holmes mysteries before this, and I decided to finally read one just to see what all the fuss is about, I guess. And I thought it was just kind of decent. Okay, I didn't love it. I didn't hate it. Let me see. I gave it like a flat 3 out of 5. It wasn't bad. I thought it was decent for what it was. This doesn't make me want to go out and read a bunch of other Sherlock Holmes stuff. I have heard that this is one of his more like well-known stories, and this is pretty short too. It's like kind of like a novella-length story. Let's see, a little bit longer than a novella, I guess. It's about a 200-page book, kind of a smaller size book though. And yeah, I don't really have a lot to say about this one. It was just decent, yeah. The Hound of the Baskervilles by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. Not bad, not great. The next book that I read this month is another classic. And this one is The Martian Chronicles by Ray Bradbury. This is actually a library book. I do not own this in my collection. But I will tell you that after reading this, I'm going to be looking for a copy to add to my collection. I enjoyed this quite a bit. So this book was a lot different than I expected. I went into this thinking it was going to be like a novel and have like some intricate world building and be like very heavy on like the sci-fi and like maybe fantasy a little bit. This is not like that at all. This is very, very different than from what I thought it would be. It's basically a short story collection, and I think there's even an introduction where Bradbury talks about the creation of this novel a little bit. So a lot of the stories in here were originally short stories he wrote early in his career and then threw out and published in different magazines or such. And then he eventually kind of pieced them together to create this book called The Martian Chronicles. And the short stories are sort of tied together. There's kind of like this overarching story that runs throughout them. And it's basically about man's invasion on Mars. And they are met with hostility at first from the Martians. And the Martians are kind of like killing off man's first like expedition onto the planet. And then eventually the humans prevail and kind of take over Mars and populate the planet. All the while there is like this war going on Earth. and it's like headed towards this dystopian future. There's a lot of really bad things going on at Earth, and yeah, this was a very interesting book. I really liked this, and it was pretty straightforward and easy to read for the most part. I've read some other Ray Bradbury's works where it's very dense, and his purple prose is just like painted across like the entire book, and can make it a little bit of a difficult read. This wasn't necessarily like that. It was a bit more straightforward, which I really appreciated, and it still had some of his like signature prose to it, and he has a very poetic way of like writing things, I guess. So I don't know, but yeah, I really enjoyed The Martian Chronicles. This was a pretty good book, just a lot different than I thought it would be. Let me see what I gave it. A 3.5 out of 5 stars. And there's one chapter or short story, if you want to call it that, in here that I really, really enjoyed in particular. Basically, there's these group of people living on Mars. There's this one guy who escaped from Earth to go to live on Mars, and he builds this haunted house on Mars called The Fall of the House of Usher. It's basically a replica of The Fall of the House of Usher from Edgar Allan Poe's story. And he dedicates it to all of these classic horror stories. And inside this haunted house, he builds all these different rooms and traps and giant monster figures and robots. And because it's on Mars and they have all of this advanced technology, he builds all of these just crazy different contraptions. And it was so cool. And however, this guy that did this, who is escaping Earth to come live on Mars and build this house, down on Earth, there's like this really bad government that has taken over and like burned all the books and are banning haunted houses basically and horror and pretty much everything. It's like a 1984 George Orwell type of situation. And these guys track him down and go to Mars. And he lures them into this haunted house. And they're telling them, the government guys are telling this guy that they're gonna have to burn down this haunted house. It goes against their codes, their laws. They're basically trying to bring their Earth laws over onto Mars and like ban everything and control everything. And this guy's like, all right, well, before you do, let me take you on a quick tour. Since you guys are going to burn it down tonight anyway, let me just show you this haunted house. And this group of people, part of this government thing, whatever they are, go through this haunted house and are picked off by all of these different creatures and contraptions that have been concocted in this House of Usher. And it was just incredible. There was something so satisfying about that. I loved that chapter or short story, if you want to call it that, in this book. It was incredible. So yeah. So basically, yeah, this book is just a bunch of short stories following different characters. Sometimes there are some recurring characters throughout the stories, but mostly throughout these chapters and stories, you're following different characters, and you kind of see things from different perspectives about like the population of Mars and sort of the deconstruction, the falling apart of planet Earth. And there's just all this different stuff going on, but it was really interesting. I had a good time with this book. I really enjoyed it. Solid 3.5 out of 5 stars for The Martian Chronicles by Ray Bradbury. Okay, we're almost done. Next up, I read The Reptile Room by Lemony Snicket. This is the second book in the series of unfortunate events. And I enjoyed this one quite a bit more than the first one. I gave this one a solid 3.5 out of 5 stars. And I remember really liking this one too, and this one being like a favorite when I was a kid. And I predict this will be one of my favorites of the series whenever I finish rereading through it. I don't know, maybe just because it has to do with reptiles and snakes, and that cover is awesome. And I don't know, probably. But one of the things that I liked about this book is it feels more heartfelt and also kind of tragic than the first book. In the first book, that's the one that kind of sets things into motion. And the Baudelaire orphans, the main characters of the story, they learn that their parents die. But in this one, the more tragic events and character deaths in here feel a bit more personal, a bit more heavy-hitting, and a bit more just sad than the first book. And I think the reason why is because in this one, the characters, the Baudelaire orphans, go to live with their Uncle Monty, who is a herpetologist and has this big reptile room with all of these pet snakes and different reptiles. And they get to know him, and he's this very nice guy. And after all of the bad events that happened in the first one, the kids are super relieved and happy to be with this Uncle Monty, who is very friendly to them, and they seem to finally be getting back on the right track. And then Uncle Monty is murdered by none other than the villainous Count Olaf. And then in this book, things just felt a lot more personal and heavy-hitting than the tragic events of the first one. And I think it's because you get to know these characters a bit more. Whereas in the first book, you just hear about those events happening. You don't really see it. There's no scenes or much detail or anything like that. It's basically the caretaker of these children, the Baudelaire orphans, just comes up to them and tells them that their parents died in a house fire at like the very beginning of the book. So it doesn't really hit you in the same way, I don't think. Yeah, I enjoyed this one quite a bit more, The Reptile Room. And I look forward to reading the third book in this series. So yeah, that's The Reptile Room by Lemony Snicket. Okay, and then the last book that I read this month is The House on Abigail Lane by Kealan Patrick Burt. This is one of his novellas. This is like 70 or 80 pages long, like 90. And this is basically a haunted house story. And as you guys might know, I love haunted house stories. It's like one of my favorite subgenres. And this one was decent, good. I gave it a 3.25 out of 5. And this one is written kind of like a nonfiction book, sort of, like a documentary or journal of some sort. And there are some like references in here to real life hauntings. There's like a reference in here to the Amityville horror and some other ones. And we basically follow like kind of a documented style book, I guess. It just explains the history of this house on Abigail Lane and different phenomenon that various people and reporters have experienced at this house, and the tenants of the house, the people that have lived in it. And I kind of liked this style of storytelling. It felt very unique, definitely different. It's kind of hard to write a unique haunted house story. There's so many different things that have been done with this genre, so many haunted house stories that have been written over the years. It's kind of hard to come up with something new and fresh at this point, I think. This one feels kind of unique, and I did like it for the most part. It's not really scary. It's just kind of weird, kind of messes with your head a little bit. It makes you think. It's not really a scary haunted house story. It's just a weird one. All of the different phenomenon that these characters experience or claim to experience, it's just very bizarre. And then we get to the end, and there's a little bit of a twist, along with this haunted house and a certain character. And I thought it was just kind of okay. It did end on kind of a sour note for me, I guess. I feel like the story didn't really go anywhere. I would have liked just a little bit more of a conclusive ending with it, I think. And yeah, I don't know. It was just decent. 3.25 out of 5. It was mildly good. I do plan on reading more by Kealan Patrick Burt, though, because I've enjoyed most of what I've read by him. However, after reading Kin, which I gave a near perfect 5 out of 5 stars to, and is one of my all-time favorite horror books, I don't think anything will live up to that. Kin was just absolutely amazing. But I do plan on reading his other works in the future. And yeah, this was the last book that I read this month. I gave it a 3.25 out of 5. House on Abigail Lane by Kealan Patrick Burt. Alright, that is all the books that I read this month. If you guys have any thoughts or opinions you want to share, please let me know down in the comments below. And that is all I have for today, guys. So thanks so much for watching. Peace.